Let's play some damn chess. Okay.
It's 10:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning in Greenville, South Carolina, and Pastor David Thompson stands alone at his pulpit,
Street whore.
staring at 73 empty pews. 3 months ago, this sanctuary held 420 souls every Sunday. Last week it was 112. Today it's 47. The offering plate that once overflowed now barely covers the electric bill. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. This isn't about scandal, embezzlement, or moral failure. This is about something far more profound happening across America's Bible Belt, and it's accelerating at a pace that's leaving religious scholars stunned.
Yeah.
The numbers tell a story that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Between 2019 and 2024, more than 6,000 churches across the American South closed their doors permanently.
Start the damn game.
But that statistic barely scratches the surface. What's happening isn't just churches shutting down. It's entire congregations, sometimes 3 or 4 generations deep, walking away overnight. Not to other churches, not to different denominations. They're leaving organized religion altogether, and they're doing it in the very region that gave American Christianity its most powerful voice. Meridian, Mississippi.
Man, look at
population 23,000. In 2018, this small city boasted 42 active churches. By 2023, 14 had closed. 9 others were operating at less than 25% capacity.
What's going on here?
Jennifer Walker, a third-generation Baptist who grew up singing in the choir at First Baptist Meridian, describes the moment everything changed for her. It was April 2022, right after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Her pastor devoted 3 consecutive sermons to celebrating the decision, but Jennifer noticed something peculiar. The sermons weren't about faith, compassion, or theological interpretation. They were about political victory, about winning a culture war. The following Sunday, Jennifer didn't attend church. Neither did her sister, or her mother,
Shut the damn game,
other families who had sat in those pews for decades. I realized I didn't recognize the faith I grew up with anymore, Jennifer told researchers from the Pew Research Center in a 2023 interview. It had become something else entirely, something I couldn't reconcile with the Jesus I read about in Scripture. She's not alone. The Pew Research Center's 2024 Religious Landscape Study revealed that self-identified Christians in the Bible Belt states, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas, declined by 17.3% between 2014 and 2024. But here's the twist that researchers didn't expect. The steepest decline isn't among young people. It's among Americans aged 45 to 65, the demographic that traditionally forms the backbone of church leadership and funding. The Bible Belt earned its name in the 1920s when journalist H.L. Mencken used it to describe the region's powerful evangelical presence. For nearly a century, this area represented the heartland of American Christianity, producing megachurch movements, televangelists, and sufficient political influence to shape national elections. Churches weren't just places of worship, they were community centers, social hubs, and the foundation of regional identity. To be Southern was in many ways to be church-going, until it wasn't. Before we dive deeper into this seismic shift, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Are you watching from inside the Bible Belt, experiencing this firsthand, or observing from thousands of miles away? Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about the global reach of this very American story. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we examine the historical forces shaping our world in real time. If you appreciate the research that goes into these deep dives, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue producing this content. Now, let's understand how we got here. The cracks began appearing long before anyone recognized them as structural failures. In 2015, sociologist Dr. Samuel Perry published a landmark study tracking church attendance patterns in rural Tennessee over 15 years. He discovered something unexpected. While overall attendance remained relatively stable, member engagement was
Move, you
collapsing.
whore.
People came to Sunday service but stopped attending Wednesday prayer meetings, Bible studies, and volunteer activities. The average church member's monthly engagement dropped from 12 hours to 3.7 hours between 2000 and 2015. Churches were becoming Sunday morning obligations rather than lifestyle commitments. But the real exodus began in 2016, and politics lit
That
the
woman's
fuse.
cute. Boop.
When 81% of white evangelical voters supported a thrice-married casino owner who bragged about sexual assault, something fractured in the American evangelical psyche. For many believers, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable. How could their pastors, who had preached sexual morality and family values for decades, enthusiastically endorse someone who embodied neither? Rachel Denhollander, the attorney and former
It's
gym
called the
who
lesser
became
of
the
two
first
evils,
woman to
bitch.
publicly accuse Larry Nassar of sexual assault, captured this crisis in a 2019 interview.
With spit.
What I have seen is that sexual assault victims, women and men alike, are far more willing to come forward outside the church than inside. The church is one of the least safe places to acknowledge abuse. Her
That
words
fucks with me
resonated
over
because
because
they exposed a pattern. When confronted with moral failures within their ranks, church leadership often prioritized institutional reputation over victim protection. Meanwhile, these same institutions demanded political allegiance on issues of sexual morality in the public sphere. The hypocrisy became too glaring to ignore. Consider Willow Creek Baptist Church in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In 1995, it averaged 730 attendees per Sunday.
Whore.
The church ran a successful youth program, operated a food bank, and maintained a strong community presence. Senior pastor Robert Mitchell led the congregation for 22 years with barely any controversy. Then came COVID-19, and everything unraveled with shocking speed. When Tennessee issued its first shutdown orders in March 2020,
On that
Pastor
night,
Mitchell initially complied, moving services online. But within 3 weeks,
What?
pressure from a vocal minority of congregants led him to reopen despite public health recommendations. He framed it as a test of faith versus fear, quoting scripture about not forsaking assembly.
dumbass. What?
63 families,
I got
including
one
several
word.
nurses and
I got
doctors in
one
the
word of advice for
congregation,
you.
objected.
Resign.
They argued that protecting vulnerable community members was the Christian response. Pastor Mitchell called their concerns faithless. Those 63 families left, but they weren't replaced. By the time restrictions lifted, Willow Creek's attendance had dropped to 240.
From China.
During this period, internal church communications leaked,
Dumbass.
revealing that leadership had discussed mask requirements not in terms of health outcomes, but political optics. One deacon wrote in an email, "We can't look weak by requiring masks. That's what liberal churches do." The politicization of a public health crisis within church walls profoundly disturbed remaining members. By 2023, Willow Creek Baptist had merged with another struggling congregation just to keep the lights on. COVID-19 merely accelerated trends already in motion. The real story lies deeper, in demographic and educational shifts that have been quietly reshaping the Bible Belt for 20 years.
God fucking.
Between 2000 and 2020, the percentage of college-educated adults in traditional Bible Belt states increased by 47%. This matters because education level strongly correlates with religious skepticism. Not atheism necessarily, but skepticism toward institutional religious authority. Dr. Ryan Burge, a political scientist and Baptist pastor who studies American religion, analyzed data from the General Social Survey spanning from 1972 to 2022. He found that Americans with bachelor's degrees were 2.4 times more likely to question literal biblical interpretation compared to those without college education. As Bible Belt states' education levels rose, strict biblical literalism, the theological foundation of most evangelical churches, faced unprecedented challenges. Consider this striking example. In 1995, 73% of Southern Baptist Convention members believed the earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days according to denominational surveys.
I do.
By 2023, that number had dropped to 49%. Still a majority, but a rapidly shrinking one. More importantly, among Southern Baptists under age 40, only 32% held this view. The faith's intellectual foundation was eroding from within, and church leadership largely responded by doubling down on literalism, rather than adapting theology to accommodate scientific understanding. This created an impossible choice for educated believers: abandon intellectual honesty or abandon the church. Increasingly, they chose the latter. Jackson, Mississippi provides a perfect case study. In 2010, researchers identified it as having the highest concentration of churchgoers in America, with 87% of adults reporting regular church attendance. By 2023, that figure had collapsed to 59%, still high nationally, but representing a 28-point drop in just 13 years. Researchers interviewed hundreds of former churchgoers to understand why. The most common response wasn't theological disagreement, it was exhaustion. Exhaustion from churches that had become indistinguishable from political action committees. Exhaustion from sermons that devoted more energy to culture war battles than spiritual growth. Exhaustion from watching church resources flow toward political campaigns while community needs went unmet. Marcus and Kenya Thompson, a black couple from Jackson, attended predominantly white evangelical churches for 12 years because they appreciated the contemporary worship style and robust children's programs. But after George Floyd's murder in 2020, their church experience became untenable. Their pastor addressed Floyd's death once in a 3-minute segment, emphasizing both sides and the importance of respecting law enforcement. When Kenya asked why the church hadn't organized any response to obvious racial injustice in their community, the associate pastor told her she was bringing worldly division into God's house. They left that church and tried 3 others. Each time, they encountered similar responses: either complete silence on racial justice or active hostility to the idea that systemic racism existed. By 2022, they stopped attending church altogether, though they still consider themselves Christians. "We didn't leave Jesus," Marcus explained in a 2023 documentary interview. "We left institutions that stopped following Jesus while claiming to speak for him." Their experience reflects a broader fracture. In 2020, during the height of racial justice protests, 47% of black evangelicals reported that their white fellow congregants failed to support them on racial issues, according to a Barna Group study. This represented a 20-point increase from just 5 years earlier. The result? Black church attendance in multiracial evangelical churches dropped 33% between 2019 and 2023. But perhaps nothing illustrates the Bible Belt exodus more dramatically than what happened in Branson, Missouri, a town synonymous with Christian entertainment and family values. In 2018, Branson hosted 14 megachurches and 73 smaller congregations, serving a metropolitan population of just 94,000. The city's identity was inseparable from its religious character. Then a series of scandals erupted. In 2019, the senior pastor of Branson's largest megachurch, which averaged 6,000 attendees across multiple services, resigned after admitting to a years-long extramarital affair. The church's response? They gave him a severance package worth $340,000 and prohibited abuse victims who had come forward from speaking publicly as a condition of their settlement agreements. Meanwhile, the youth pastor who reported the abuse was fired for creating division. The congregation revolted. Not immediately, but steadily. Within 18 months, attendance dropped by 62%. 3 board members resigned and publicly criticized the church's handling of abuse allegations. Local media coverage attracted national attention, and suddenly Branson's church community found itself under unprecedented scrutiny. Here's where it gets really interesting. Researchers expected people to simply move to other Branson churches. That's the historical pattern. When one congregation fails, members redistribute to others nearby. But that's not what happened. Overall church attendance across all Branson congregations declined by 29% between 2019 and 2023. People weren't redistributing, they were leaving entirely. Dr. Kristen Dumez, a historian who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, a book examining evangelicalism's relationship with masculinity and power, argues this represents a fundamental trust collapse. For generations, evangelical culture taught that leaving the church meant leaving God, she explained in a 2023 lecture. That equation is breaking down.
With the knife.
People are realizing they can pursue faith, morality, and spirituality without institutions that have repeatedly betrayed their trust. Financial data confirms this shift. Total giving to evangelical churches in Bible Belt states declined by 21.6% between 2019 and 2023 when adjusted for inflation, according to the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. But here's the crucial detail. Charitable giving overall in those same states only declined by 3.2%. Money didn't disappear, it redirected. Former churchgoers were supporting local charities, mutual aid organizations, and direct assistance programs instead of religious institutions. This represents an earthquake in American charitable infrastructure. For over a century, churches served as the primary charitable organizations in most southern communities. They ran food banks, operated counseling services, provided disaster relief, and maintained social safety nets. As church funding collapses, these services are either disappearing or being assumed by secular nonprofit organizations, a fundamental restructuring of community support systems. Consider what happened in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. When 3 major churches closed between 2020 and 2022, they had collectively operated 5 food pantries, serving approximately 2,000 families monthly. Only one secular nonprofit existed to absorb that capacity. Within 6 months, food insecurity in Tuscaloosa County increased by 41%. The crisis forced county government to step in with direct assistance programs, essentially replacing church charity with tax-funded social services. This pattern is repeating across the Bible Belt, creating a strange irony. The region most opposed to government social programs is being forced to expand them because church infrastructure can no longer sustain community needs. But resistance to this transformation remains fierce. Some denominations are fighting back aggressively. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, lost more than 2 million members between 2018 and 2023, a 13% decline. Their response has been to purge moderates and consolidate around increasingly rigid theological and political positions. In 2023, the SBC expelled 5 churches for having female pastors and censured dozens more for being insufficiently opposed to LGBTQ inclusion. These actions accelerated departures rather than preventing them. Dr. Beth Moore, one of evangelical Christianity's most prominent Bible teachers, left the Southern Baptist Convention in 2021 after decades of affiliation. Her departure sent shockwaves through evangelical culture. If someone as theologically conservative and institutionally loyal as Beth Moore couldn't stay, who could? Her explanation was devastatingly simple. I'm still a Baptist, but I can no longer identify with Southern Baptists. The ship has sailed on that one. She cited the denomination's handling of sexual abuse, its treatment of abuse survivors, and its prioritization of political power over gospel witness. The youth exodus compounds everything else. Generation Z, those born between 1997 and 2012, shows the lowest religious affiliation in American history. In Bible Belt states, only 34% of Gen Z identifies as Christian, compared to 76% of baby boomers. Youth pastors report that the pipeline from youth group to adult congregation has completely broken down. Teenagers who actively participate in church during high school routinely disappear after graduation and never return. Why? When researchers actually ask them, the answers are remarkably consistent. They describe churches as hypocritical institutions obsessed with sexual purity for youth, while ignoring sexual abuse by leaders. They see environmental destruction ignored while leaders debate Genesis creation timelines. They watch churches prioritize building campaigns over addressing homelessness. They observe LGBTQ friends rejected and harmed by religious communities that preach about love. And critically, they have access to information their parents never did. A teenager in rural Arkansas with a smartphone can fact-check biblical interpretations, research church history, study biblical scholarship, and connect with diverse faith perspectives impossible to access a generation ago. When their pastor claims Noah's flood was a literal worldwide event 6,000 years ago, they can immediately review geological evidence contradicting that claim. Authority based solely on pastoral position no longer works. Some churches are adapting. Progressive congregations in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Austin are growing, but they represent a small minority. They've embraced LGBTQ inclusion, women in leadership, science-compatible theology, and social justice missions. They're capturing some of the exodus, particularly educated professionals under 50, but not most of it. For every person joining a progressive church, 3 more are leaving organized religion altogether. The economic consequences are starting to shape regional development. Commercial real estate developers in Dallas, Nashville, and Raleigh are increasingly buying closed church properties, converting them into breweries, event venues, climbing gyms, and apartments. In 2023 alone, more than 800 church properties across the Bible Belt were sold for commercial redevelopment. Each one represents a congregation that couldn't sustain itself financially. But perhaps the most profound impact is political. For 40 years, Republican political strategy rested on mobilizing evangelical voters in Bible Belt states. Church buildings served as organizing hubs. Pastors delivered politically charged sermons. Voting guides distributed in church parking lots told congregants which candidates God supposedly endorsed. This machine delivered elections. It's breaking down. In the 2022 midterms, white evangelical turnout in Bible Belt states dropped by 9 percentage points compared to 2018. The largest decline since exit polling began tracking the demographic. Younger evangelicals, when they vote at all, no longer vote as a monolithic bloc. Among white evangelicals under 40, Donald Trump's approval rating was 43% in 2023, compared to 76% among white evangelicals over 60, according to PRI polling. Political strategists on both sides recognize what this means. The God, guns, and gays messaging that dominated Southern politics for a generation is losing its potency because the infrastructure that amplified it, the church, is collapsing. Republican candidates in 2024 primaries began noticeably reducing church appearances and religious rhetoric, focusing instead on economic and cultural grievances with less explicitly religious framing. Yet for all these statistics and trends, individual stories capture the human cost of this transformation. Sarah Mitchell grew up in Abilene, Texas, attending church 3 times weekly. She married her high school sweetheart in her childhood church. They dedicated both their children there. For 37 years, her church defined her social world, her support network, her identity. Then, in 2021, her 18-year-old daughter came out as lesbian. Sarah's immediate response was acceptance and love. Her church's response was ultimatum. Either publicly denounce her daughter's lifestyle and refuse to affirm her identity, or leave the congregation. Sarah chose her daughter. She lost her community overnight. Friends she'd known for decades stopped returning calls. Her Bible study group excluded her. Even her own sister wouldn't speak to her for months. "I didn't lose my faith," Sarah said in a 2023 podcast interview, her voice cracking. "But I lost my church, and with it, I lost what I thought was my family." Turns out their love was very conditional. She hasn't attended church since, and she says she never will. The wound is too deep. Multiply Sarah's story by tens of thousands, and you begin to understand the human dimension of these statistics. Each percentage point represents broken relationships, fractured identities, and profound disillusionment. For many, leaving church means losing the only community they've ever known. The question now is what replaces it. Some former churchgoers are creating new communities, spiritual but explicitly not religious. Book clubs focusing on theology and philosophy. Hiking groups incorporating meditation and reflection. Volunteer organizations emphasizing service without evangelism. These tie-dye structures provide community and meaning without institutional hierarchy or doctrinal rigidity. Others have simply embraced isolation. Dr. Robert Putnam's research on social capital found that Americans have fewer close friends, less community engagement, and more social isolation than any previous generation. Church decline contributes significantly to this trend in the South, where churches historically served as the primary community-building institution. So where does this end? Demographic projections suggest the trend will accelerate. By 2030, researchers predict that fewer than half of Americans in traditional Bible Belt states will identify as Christian, a threshold that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Some denominations will adapt and survive in smaller, more theologically flexible forms.
God damn it.
Others will consolidate into increasingly rigid remnants, serving aging populations until demographic reality forces closure. But here's what's certain. The Bible Belt as a defining feature of American culture and politics is dying. Not dead, but dying. The next decade will determine what, if anything, emerges to replace the social, charitable, and community functions that churches have served for generations. That's not a judgment about whether this change is good or bad. It's simply acknowledgement of the most significant religious transformation in American history happening right now. In real time, largely unseen by those not directly affected. We're watching the collapse of cultural infrastructure that took 2 centuries to build, happening over barely a decade. The full consequences won't be clear for years, but we're living through a historical inflection point that will reshape American society, politics, and culture in ways we're only beginning to understand. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. What profession are you in, and how has this shift affected your community or work? I genuinely love to know in the comments. If you found this research valuable, subscribing helps us continue producing these deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.
Goddamn motherfucker. Fuck. I curse the Holy Ghost can go to hell if I don't win this next game. Go to hell, Holy Ghost, if I don't win this next game. Jesus fucking goddamn Holy Ghost fucking Christ.
It's 10:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning in Greenville, South Carolina, and Pastor David Thompson stands alone at his pulpit, staring at 73 empty pews. 3 months ago, this sanctuary
Bart Ehrman versus William Lane Craig, classic debate. I enhanced it. The audio should be better. Even though some of the words sound a little bit funny, you know what they're saying. But I'm going to tell you, it's kind of hard to really trust everything that, like, what William Lane Craig does is he, like, cherry picks a scholarship in the field. And I just hate to break it to you. I feel like, as I've studied a lot of the scholarship, there's usually, like, the apologetic realm of academia, or people who are sympathetic to it. You have critical scholarship that tries to be secular in their approach and doesn't try to treat the New Testament above any of the miraculous claims of Caesars or the miraculous claims of other demigods and heroes in mythical literature. And then you have those who kind of have faith or believe and yet do critical scholarly work. And there's this weird kind of negotiation here in the middle that happens. If you are curious to know more, talk to Richard C. Miller about his view. He has a view about this. But I say that to say that love Bart Ehrman, love his critical scholarship, love his approach on the apocalyptic Jesus, but I do wonder if he is coming at this with some models of his New Testament scholarship that kind of falls trapped to some of the things that William Lane Craig demands. He demands these are the 4 absolute facts accepted by all scholars when they aren't accepted by all scholars. And when a field for hundreds of years started from the Protestant Reformation, technically, Catholics versus those protesting, and then internal critiques within Christianity but still believing, you kind of wonder if we've inherited some of these facts or expectations of what is really historical because of that tidal wave of people who've told us how to think about scholarship when it comes to Bible. But when an outsider or someone who has more classical research and a broader spectrum of Greek literature under their belt, and they approach us and go, it looks and acts and sounds very much like this other literature, then we don't have a problem. So we're going to continue this reaction to the debate between Bart Ehrman William Lane Craig on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I may chime in because it's something that I can't help myself with. On this debate, I can't help but give you another side that may not get represented. But thankfully, we're getting Bart Ehrman's take this time. I look forward to seeing what he has to say. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like it. Forgive me for the long-winded intro. I needed to lay this out because if you're not acquainted with it, you won't be familiar with the fact that Bible scholarship and being critical of the Bible started with Christians. And it did not start with Christians in order to say Christian faith is not true. It was not geared toward trying to be a debunker of the faith. It was geared toward trying to get closer to what the facts may be, and new tools of scholarly thought come in. And at the end of the day, here I am, not a Christian anymore, going, you know, why are they treating this eyewitness stuff, bona fide historical eyewitness claims, but they don't do it for the people who come before the courts in Rome and say they saw the Caesars after they were dead. They don't act like we got to make sense of this hallucination model. We got to make sense of this with this model. No, they can't just jump to literature or propaganda. They can't say that's part of it. No, we have to say they're authentic and they had a sincere belief and it had to be. Why couldn't this have been a crafted story invented? 2 Peter was. But anyway, I digress. Let's continue. Love y'all. Let's have a good day.
Well, I'd like to thank Bill for that highly impressive opening statement. I've heard over the years that Bill is a skilled debater and rhetorician, and now I've seen for myself why the evangelical Christians that he speaks for are so proud of his abilities. In my opening speech here, I'll not be dealing directly with the many, many points that Bill has already raised. I'll instead lay out my own case, which, by the way, is not exactly the case that he said.
I kind of thought he might misrepresent Bart in this. I kid you not, especially on the empty tomb stuff. He's a bit exaggerative. This is how William Lane Craig does. He's a great car salesman. And in the ancient world, Plato, his critique against the Sophists was that they would argue for positions they knew were wrong, just to be able to debate and have a better skilled argument against their opponents. And that's like a terrible school when you have people who are better at arguing against you when their views are not true.
Vic? Although there are some points of similarity. I'll lay out my own case, and in my next speech, I'll show why, in my opinion, the position that he has just staked out is so problematic. I want to say at the outset something similar to what he said at the beginning of his speech. I used to believe absolutely everything that Bill just presented.
Yep. Same here. Guilty as charged.
But
it's not unfortunate, or sadly, as Bill would say in my prior reactions. If you haven't watched those, go watch those.
Went to the same evangelical Christian college, Wheaton, where these things are taught. Even before that, I went to a yet more conservative school, Moody Bible Institute, where Bible is our middle name. We were taught these things there even more avidly. I used to believe them with my whole heart and soul. I used to preach them and try to convince others that they were true. But then I began studying these matters, not simply accepting what my teachers had said, but looking at them deeply myself. I learned Greek and started studying the New Testament in the original Greek language. I learned
You can tell the AI, trust me when I tell you, if you go and watch the original, it's hard to hear what they're saying. There's so much noise. AI kind of tweaks his voice a little in this, but it's so much more tolerable. You know what he's saying. If you go watch the original, it's a pain in the ass to listen, and for 2 hours, you're not going to really enjoy listening to it.
Hebrew to read the Old Testament. I learned Latin.
He learned Hebrew, Latin, Greek, now he's about to say, I think, Syriac.
And Coptic, to be able to study the New Testament manuscripts and the non-canonical traditions of Jesus in their original languages. I immersed myself in the world of first century, reading non-Christian Jewish and pagan texts from the Roman Empire and before. And I tried to master everything written by a Christian from the first 300 years of the Church. I became a historian of antiquity, and for 25 years now I have done my research in this area night and day. I'm not a philosopher like Bill. I'm a historian, dedicated to finding the historical truth. After years of study, I finally came to the conclusion that everything I had previously thought about the historical evidence of the resurrection was absolutely wrong.
Woohoo! Absolutely wrong. Jeez.
Let me begin by explaining, in simple terms, what it is that historians do. Historians try to establish, to the best of their ability, what probably happened in the past.
Probably.
We can't really know the past because the past is done with. We think we know the past in some instances because we have such good evidence for what happened in the past, but in other cases we don't know, and in some cases we just have to throw up our hands in despair. It is relatively certain that Bill Clinton won the election in 1996. It may be somewhat less clear who won the election next time. It's pretty clear that Shakespeare wrote his plays, but there's considerable debate. Why? It was hundreds of years ago, and scholars come up with alternative opinions. It's probable that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but we don't have a lot of eyewitness testimony. Historians try to establish levels of probability of what happened in the past. Some things are absolutely certain, some are probable, some are possible, some are maybe, some are probably not. What kinds of evidence do scholars look for when trying to establish probabilities in the facts? Well, the best kind of evidence, of course, consists of contemporary accounts, people who were close to the time of the events themselves. Ultimately, if you don't have a source that goes back to the time period itself, then you don't have a reliable source. There's only two sources of information for past events. Either stories that actually happened, based on ultimately eyewitness accounts, or stories that have been made up.
I personally go with the second part. I just read the Gospels so obviously as fictive. It's not just me. It's not like a bias. I mean, when you open a book and it tells you the heavens rent open, and then the immediate thing is he spends 40 days in the desert where he's like tempted from the devil, and then the next page you turn, another miracle happens, and then the next page another miracle, and all these miracle wild claims are happening. He's reading minds. There's omniscient authorship where the author knows things that you, the reader, know. That when you actually break it down, you don't really know how they know this. Things like that give away the fictional aspect. Does that mean there's not some ground behind it that they're operating from? No. But good luck trying to know what that is. That's why I'm so much more cautious about being certain about any position. Did Jesus exist or did Jesus not exist? Like anyone honest in that kind of research should not have that extreme kind of certainty or act like they know. No, but when you look at this, it's obvious that this genre operates like fiction in my view.
Those are the only two kinds of stories you have from the past. Either things that happened or things that were made up. To determine which things are the things that happened, you want contemporary accounts, things that are close to the time of the events themselves, and it helps if you have a lot of these accounts. The more the merrier. You want lots of contemporary accounts, and you want these accounts to be independent of one another.
Here we go. Independent. Well, that kept coming up. William Lane Craig acts like all the Gospels are independent.
You don't want different accounts to have collaborated with one another.
He knows that's the Gospels.
You want accounts that are independently attesting the results. Moreover, even though you want accounts that are independent of one another, that have not collaborated, you want accounts that corroborate one another. Accounts that are consistent in what they have to say about the subject. Moreover, finally, you want sources that are not biased toward the subject matter.
You mean you don't want literature written by the cult members themselves trying to persuade you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God? You mean to tell me you don't want the Mormons telling you in their book, the Book of Mormon, to believe that Joseph Smith is the final prophet? You want an outside source from an unbiased kind of perspective, or a perspective that does not come from the cult member themselves trying to persuade you to believe it? You mean to tell me, Bart, that we aren't supposed to have Muslims tell us that Muhammad is the final prophet and that we must accept the Quran as the holy word of God directly from Allah, transmitted through Gabriel to the prophet himself, and he vocally spoke it, and later they wrote these things down, and we should believe every word of that? So you mean we should actually have sources that don't come from the cult members themselves that are so biased and trying to sell you the cult that they're going to be dishonest in that approach if you understand their literature to be literal or even trying to imply that it really happened?
Christ.
I agree.
She's a
You
fucking
want accounts
Christ.
that are disinterested. You want lots of. You want them independent of one
I
another.
want gospel. I want literature that tells us about Jesus from a negative point of view, contemporaneous. I want gospels to tell us not negative point of view, that just give us information about the cult very early on. I want more information. We have that with Mormonism. We have people who are from the town over. We have writings and newspapers, people who actually went and visited, and there's so much information about Joseph Smith, enough that I think anyone who's not already indoctrinated from birth or part of the cult to begin with, would likely look at this information and go, yeah, he's not, there's no divinity here, this is not a divine prophet for real. Like, anyone who reads and knows the various voices would be much more cautious, and ancient historians did that. They would say it is said, or some of these people think this, however, be careful, I'm skeptical. Like, they give you caution before you buy into what is being sold. What do the Gospels do? This is the Gospel. This is the story of the Son of God, Jesus the Christ. Well, you're going to believe straight from the beginning. There is no caution. There is no skepticism. It is full-blown selling you a car you better buy.
Another, you want them to be consistent with one another. What do we have with the Gospels of the New Testament? Well, unfortunately, we're not as well off as we would like to be. We'd like to be extremely well off because the Gospels tell us about Jesus and they are our best sources for Jesus. But how good are they as historical sources? I'm not questioning whether they're valuable as theological sources, or sources for religious information, but how good are they as historical sources? Unfortunately, they're not as good as we would like. The Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death.
So in the 30s, right? Now this is old. This is 2006, and Bart might have changed his mind, but I don't know. Sometimes Bart holds views that, are just a couple decades ago most scholars held to, or most critical scholars. For example, Luke Acts. There's a growing trend of critical scholars who think Luke Acts is 2nd century. I mean, like, we're talking the 120s, 130s, even up to the 140s, 110s, 2nd century. Last I checked, when I interviewed Bart about this, Luke and Acts, he put in the 85, 90s, I believe, somewhere around there. John, he put almost to, the 2nd century, but he likes to put it up in the 90s to the 100s. The other problem is like John. A lot of these scholars will put John in the 2nd century, 120s, 130s, 140s. Like, they're willing to go pretty far with these Gospels. Mind you, Papias only mentions Matthew and two Matthews and a Mark. It seems like he mentions two Matthews, but there's only Matthew and Mark. He does not mention a Luke or a John. He doesn't mention it. That doesn't mean they don't exist, or some form of it might. If you grant that Papias is writing the 110s, that's also up for debate. There's so much up for debate, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not this confident case that William Lane Craig likes to lay out in front of people when you take this serious and start diving into the critical scholarship. So, I know I went off into a tangent, but to point out, the case for how late these Gospels are written is actually worse in some cases, possibly, than this idea 30 up to 60 years. It may be, 30 up to 100 years. Because if Jesus died in the 30s, some of these Gospels might have been written in the 130s of the next century, a whole 100 years. That just depends on which scholar you're looking at and why they make the case. No one knows for sure.
35 or 65 years after his death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels are written by highly literate, trained, Greek-speaking Christians of the 2nd and 3rd generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers. They're written by people living 30, 40, 50, 60 years later.
That's a problem already. We're reading an English translation, right, of the Greek that a Jewish man who is speaking in Aramaic is, teaching in. So you're already dealing with a Greek, the original text, which we don't even have those, which is another problem, but either way, I digress. The Greek is a translation of, supposedly, the sayings of Jesus, who's an Aramaic-speaking Jew. What do apologists do? What do they begin to do? Well, Jesus spoke Greek. Ha! Now you're saving him from that discontinuity between the Aramaic into the Greek.
Did these people get their information from? I should point out, in our Gospels, the Gospels say they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but that's just in your English Bible. That's the title of these Gospels. But whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew didn't call it the Gospel of Matthew. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew simply wrote his Gospel, and somebody later said it's the Gospel according to Matthew. Somebody later is telling you who wrote it, the titles that are later additions. These are not eyewitness accounts, so where did they get their stories from? After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith.
So I think he's going to go down this orality path, and that is something that Bart Ehrman does. Keep in mind, many of my scholarly friends that I enjoy listening to these days question this. Not that people aren't telling stories. There's no doubt on what he's saying that they're telling stories, but that the Gospels themselves are based off of oral tells of Jesus in that way. They're not so convinced on this oral continuity to the sayings of Jesus as if they really retain some oral sense of knowing what he said back here. A lot of them question it.
Trying to convert both Jews and Gentiles. How do you convert somebody to stop worshiping their gods to start worshiping Jesus? You have to tell stories about Jesus. Mm-hmm. So you convert somebody on the basis of the stories you tell.
Yep.
That person can convert somebody who converts somebody who converts somebody, and all along the line, people are telling stories. The way it works is this. I'm a businessman in Ephesus. And somebody comes to town and tells me stories about Jesus, and on the basis of these stories I hear, I convert. I tell my wife these stories. She converts. She tells the next door neighbor the stories. She converts. She tells her husband the stories. He converts. He goes on a business trip to Rome, and he tells people there the stories. They convert. Those people have heard the stories in Rome. Where did they hear them from? They heard them from the guy that lived next door to me. Well, was he there to see these things happen? No. Where did he hear them from? He heard them from his wife. Where did his wife hear them from? Was she there? No. Where did she hear them from my wife? Where did my wife hear them? She heard them from me. Well, where did I hear them from? I wasn't there either. Stories are in circulation year after year after year, and as a result of that, the stories get changed.
So yeah, a lot of scholars I know don't necessarily go down that path. This is true no matter what you do. Stories are going to be telling. A lot of them think that the Gospels are written, as art pieces. These are books crafted by a literate, educated author who intended to write these kind of tales. The question is there oral material, oral storytelling behind the Gospels? Maybe. Probably. I mean, where do they get this? Where do they get their information from about Jesus? But there's a lot of scholars who notice that the construction of the Gospels are based on Old Testament scriptures. That they're looking and they're finding, and this is just one example because there's also Greek material, but mostly they'll go to scripture. They could see the construction of the narratives themselves from Old Testament scripture. So you don't need to necessarily invoke the orality approach when you can find the Elijah-Elisha narratives in Mark for Jesus. So Jesus is a rewrite of Elijah and Elisha with its own spin. Moses with its own spin. Joseph with his 12 brothers with its own spin. So Bible characters and stories from the Old Testament literally get kind of re-spun into New Testament text or stories. The author, of course, has their own agenda, but you don't need to go, okay, I heard 15 stories, I'm going to run around and collect these oral stories from different Christians to craft the Gospels. That's the point of contention, it seems.
How do we know that the stories got changed in the process of transmission? We know the stories got changed because there are numerous differences in our accounts that cannot be reconciled with one another.
So contradictions, but real quick, We're talking about the literary product of the Gospels. So, Bart might take the orality approach in some aspects, and there may be some truth to that up to where we get our Gospel Mark, first Gospel. But we're talking whether you agree with that view or take the view the other scholars I have, Richard Miller, Dennis MacDonald, Robin Faith Walsh, others who seem to not go down this community/orality approach, much more literate, intentional invention of the Jesus story as authors competing, so-called elites. Once you pass that and you're dealing with the Gospels, what Bart is saying is that each Gospel is going to differ and grow in their own embellishments.
You don't need to take my word for this. Simply look yourself.
Yep.
I tell my students that that the reason we don't notice there's so many differences in the Gospels is because we read the Gospels horizontally. Mm-hmm. I mean, we read them vertically, from top to bottom. You start at the top of Mark, you read through it to the bottom. You start at the top of Matthew, read it to the bottom, sounds a lot like Mark. Then you read Luke, top to bottom, sounds a lot like Matthew and Mark. Read John, a little bit different, sounds about the same. The reason is because we're reading them vertically. The way to see differences in the Gospels is to read them horizontally. Read one story in Matthew, then the same story in Mark, and compare your two stories and see what you come up with.
Dude, this is so good because William Lane Craig is so not getting into these weeds. He does his typical car salesman spiel and then he quotes Gerd Ludemann, and such says, it's practically certain. And he just does this quote mining, and he did this with physicists when it's so outside of his, expertise. This is his skill. He's a sophist. He's an expert sophist when it comes to this stuff. Bart Ehrman is going to meticulously look at the manuscript tradition, not just like the Gospels we have, but the various versions of Mark and the various versions of Matthew that we have remaining in the oldest manuscript tradition, and he'll find out how those don't even agree, let alone Matthew agreeing with Mark. You've got Matthew not agreeing with Matthew in manuscript tradition, and Mark not agreeing with Mark and Luke, and it's just, it's so crazy. Once you start actually peeling back the layers, you really start seeing the whole Jenga tower fall. The house of cards starts to collapse, which I think is what led toward Bart Ehrman's kind of not holding the New Testament as if it's sacred. It's very man-made.
You come up with major differences. Just take the death of Jesus. What day did Jesus die on? And what time of day? Did he die on the day before the Passover meal was eaten, as John explicitly says? Or did he die after it was eaten, as Mark explicitly says?
That's kind of a big deal. See, historical fact, you got the earliest Gospels can't even agree on the day he gets crucified. William Lane Craig, literally in his opening statement, acted like it's a minor thing. These are peripheral issues. The day in which he died is peripheral? But you want to act like, we can be bona fide fact that people appeared at the tomb. What day did they appear at the tomb? What day did he die? Well, we can't. That could be disputed. But the tomb was empty, and they did appear, and they saw that it was empty, and he did appear. Bro, you can't even get
damn it.
a few sentences prior to what we're hearing about him supposedly rising and people appearing at the empty tomb. They can't even agree what day he gets crucified and killed and buried. That's a big deal. So William Lane Craig's whole thing collapses under scrutiny.
Did he die at noon, as in John, or at 9 a.m., as in Mark? Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way himself, or did Simon of Cyrene carry his cross? It depends which gospel you read. Mm-hmm. Did both robbers mock Jesus on the cross, or did only one of them mock him, and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died or after he died? It depends which gospel you read.
And that's kind of a big deal too. What happens due to his death?
Fucking Christ!
How the sun and the moon and the stars don't darken. This is all big issues. Bart's coming out with a banger. And what's interesting about this argument that Bart brings in, it's the same argument that I recall Alex O'Connor bringing to the table in his debate with Phil over against the Kanekal Christians on whether or not God exists. And he spouts off these contradictions, similar to what Bart did here decades ago, against the Kanekals. I hope I'm saying their name right. But Alex O'Connor went with the same approach and does this same thing when he is debating them on the trustworthiness of the Gospels as history or what is believable about them. I'm going to wrap up this one right here. We're going to continue with Bart Ehrman, and I love he's bringing banger after banger literally towards William Lane Craig's entire case. What do you think about what was said? And I hope that my commentary was useful, that I'm not getting in the way, but I think it's necessary to give you some of the nuance of scholarship along the way that I've been learning, some of the more cutting-edge new stuff that I'm coming across, and also seeing how maybe both of them can work together. There might be some of both happening here, with what Bart's model might be, and of course these more classicist New Testament scholars who are bringing their own take in. Please, drop a comment below. YouTube rewards channels that see that kind of interaction, so I hope you always make noise in my comment sections. It helps us out. Be sure to subscribe, that's number 2, and hit the bell so you get notified when we do these. If you hit the bell and hit all, you'll get notified. 3, like it. Stupid! So if you like this stuff and want more people to know about this, like the video. And then lastly, if you have a community to share it to, friends, family, whatever, share it.
Alright, fuck.
Until next time.
Oh! Bad! Badly. I fucked his butt.
Mary's virginity is a central tenet in most or all Christian denominations. But when did the story develop? Today, Dr. Bart Ehrman joins me to talk about where the idea of a virgin birth might have come from and when it was first introduced into the Christian canon. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Hello again. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure you knew about the specials we're running this December on all of our Christmas-themed courses. Highlights include a brand new course with Dr. Jody Magnus, Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas, plus a new face-to-face on the Bible discussion asking, was Jesus really born in Bethlehem? A lively conversation between Bart and Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin. We're also offering up to 60% off our Christmas courses with a limited time Christmas bundle. Head over to bartehrman.com/courses for all the holiday deals, good for December only. And as always, use the code MJPodcast at checkout for a special discount. Welcome back everybody to Misquoting Jesus, where today we're talking about exactly when in Christian history the virgin birth story originated. We also have our bonus segment, Misquoting Bart, at the end, where I ask Bart to respond to something someone has said about him. So be sure to stick around for that. Before we get into all of that, Bart, how are you doing today?
Yeah, no, I'm doing well, and we're heading overseas for Christmas to see Sarah's family, and so that'll be nice. And I'm actually seeing it as like the major a major moment in my life, because I'm not coming back to teach, and like the school thing will be done, and entering into the next phase. And so as a 70-year-old, I'm thinking, I'm halfway there now.
That's an exciting time.
Yeah. So how are you doing?
Good. Also heading overseas. We're going to the other end of the country to you, though. We're spending Christmas just outside Glasgow with my sister. So that will be absolutely wonderful. I think I'm seeing all of my siblings and most of my nieces and nephews. I'm very, very excited.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That Glasgow area is fantastic. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
That will be good. Now, before we get to virgin births and all of that stuff, what is something in biblical scholarship that you believed like 20 years ago, let's say, but don't anymore?
Right. Well, I even though I believe in like knowing what I believe and kind of being sure that I'm right most of the time. I actually do. I really believe in looking at evidence, and if I'm wrong about something, just admitting, yeah, okay, I got that one wrong. And that happens a lot in my field, because I just, I start seeing things differently. One thing that was kind of significant is for many, many years, I argued that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not portray Jesus as God. And there are reasons for thinking that that's true, because he never calls himself God or indicates that he's God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But I finally got to a point where I realized that this is when I was writing my book, How Jesus Became God, when I realized that they don't portray Jesus as an incarnate being who came from heaven to earth, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They definitely don't do that. But they do understand that Jesus is God in some sense. And it's that in some sense that really matters, because in the ancient world, there are different views about divinities and how they relate. And even within Judaism, yes, there's the one God, but there are other beings who are called God, even in the Hebrew Bible. And I came to realize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke did understand Jesus as divine during his lifetime, just not the same way that John did, or the same way you have in the Nicene Creed. And for me, that's a pretty big change, because I've long insisted, no, they don't see him as God. But now I think they do.
And actually, related to that would be the virgin birth, because for a lot of people that is directly related.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about the fact that gods in the Greco-Roman world quite regularly had children with mortal women. I'm looking at you, Zeus.
Understand that Jesus is God in some sense. They don't portray Jesus as an incarnate being who came from heaven to earth, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They definitely don't do that. But they do understand that Jesus is God in some sense. And it's that in some sense that really matters, because in the ancient world, there are different views about divinities and how they relate. And even within Judaism, yes, there's the one God, but there are other beings who are called God, even in the Hebrew Bible. And I came to realize that Matthew, Mark, and Luke did understand Jesus as divine during his lifetime, just not the same way that John did, or the same way you have in the Nicene Creed. And for me, that's a pretty big change, because I've long insisted, no, they don't see him as God. But now I think they do.
And actually, related to that would be the virgin birth, because for a lot of people that is directly related.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about the fact that gods in the Greco-Roman world quite regularly had children with mortal women. I'm looking at you, Zeus. But what about virgin births? Was that also a common occurrence?
No, I don't think
That's
so.
one of those damn pieces of goodbye.
The thing is, all of these accounts are different from one another. So the account of the birth of Hercules, or Heracles in Greek, is different from the account of the birth of Alexander the Great. They're both said to have been born of the union of a divine being and a woman, so God and a woman. And there are lots of other stories like this, but all the stories are very different from each other. And so it's not that like the Christian story is set apart everything else. Like everything is set apart from everything else, right? And so they're all different. But the difference in the Christian story is that Mary's never had sex. And in all of the pagan and Roman versions that we have available to us, in some sense, the woman actually is engaged in some kind of physical sex act. A lot of times, maybe even most of the time, it's a woman who's already married who's had sex a lot, for her family. But then a god gets her pregnant as well. And in other cases, the god gets her pregnant through penetration. I mean, it's a physical sex act. And at least in the New Testament, Mary is not. It's not that kind of thing. Mary becomes pregnant as a virgin.
So we don't have virgin births in classical mythology, even if there were a lot of demigods wandering around. What about in Israelite tradition? Was the anticipated Messiah supposed to be born of a virgin?
So the virgin birth stories in Matthew and Luke, there are only two accounts of them, have many similarities to Old Testament accounts of
of people being miraculously born by an intervention of God. But again, even in the Old Testament, that's always the case with somebody who's been married and having sex a lot and just can't have a baby, and God does a miracle. And so the idea of a virgin birth is actually not found even in the Old Testament. The early Christians claimed it was, though. not in the narrative of somebody else, but in this prophecy in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, there is a verse that in the Greek version of the Old Testament that the New Testament authors, Matthew and Luke, would have been using, says that a virgin will conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel. And so the Christians claimed that this passage in Isaiah was the anticipation that the Son of God would come into the world through a virgin birth.
Move, you whore!
What does that passage actually describe? Because I'm
something else.
Other than decent authority, it's not actually a virgin birth.
Yeah, I think one problem with messianic prophecy that people still appeal to today. My students will often point out to me, this verse or that verse or that other verse, and they'll never read the verse in its context. Let alone, obviously, usually not in the original language. This passage in Isaiah became very important and became a debating point in early Christianity. In the second century, we have a church father, Justin Martyr, who has a dialogue in which he has a debate with a rabbi about Jesus fulfilling prophecy, and they have a debate about this very verse. And the issues that they debate then are still relevant to today. Because the rabbi points out that, in fact, the verse in Hebrew does not say that she's a virgin. And so, when you actually read the passage, nobody does. People just look at chapter 7, verse 14. If you actually read the passage, it's quite clear what this is all about, and it's not about a future Messiah. There's no reference to a Messiah in this passage. In Isaiah 7, the king of Israel, or the king of Judea, is really worried because Jerusalem is under siege by two foreign armies. And he calls in the prophet Isaiah to tell him what God's got in mind about this. Are we going to be destroyed or not? And Isaiah tells the king that God's going to give a sign. That there's this young woman here who is pregnant. And when she brings forth a son, before the son is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, before that happens, when he's just an infant still, these armies will disperse. And so when he says it in the Hebrew text, it doesn't say a virgin shall conceive. It says a young woman has conceived and will bear a son. And the name of the son will be Emmanuel, God is with us, meaning that this will be God's sign that before this child is old enough, the political military problem will disappear. Yeah.
How do you get from that Hebrew prophecy about something entirely different to a virgin giving birth to the Messiah?
Yeah. So the Hebrew Bible was read in Hebrew by Jews living in Israel at the time. Most of them couldn't read, but they heard it read in Hebrew. Jews outside of Israel generally didn't know Hebrew, and so the Bible had been translated into the widespread language at the time, Greek. And so there were Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible in circulation for Jews outside of Israel. And in the Greek translation, of course, things get changed when you translate from one language to another, and words mean a variety of things in both languages. The word for young woman in the Hebrew of chapter 7, verse 14 of Isaiah, the word is alma, and it's not the word Greek. It's not the Hebrew word for a woman who's never had sex, but it's a word for a young woman. And in Greek, one way to translate alma is with the word parthenos. Parthenos is a word that means young maiden. It often means a young woman who's never had sex, but it doesn't have to mean that. Eventually, it took on that meaning. It would be any person who had never had sex, any woman who had never had sex. So it eventually came to mean that. when the Greek translators of what we call the Septuagint, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, when they translated Isaiah, they translated Isaiah 7:14 with the word Parthenos. When later, centuries later, when Matthew's reading his Bible, he's not reading it in Hebrew, he's reading it in Greek, he runs across the word Parthenos, and he thinks it means woman who's never had sex. And so he uses that as a reference to how the Savior, Emmanuel, God with us, will come into the world. And so he comes up with a story about them never having about Joseph and Mary never having sex.
Okay, so no actual virgin births in the Old Testament.
No.
We see it in the Gospel of Matthew. What about our earliest Gospel, Mark? Is there anything in there that talks about Mary as a virgin, or anything that could shed some light on early views of this?
Well, no, it's not in Mark, it's not in John, it's not in Paul, it's not in any other author of the New Testament. Mark begins with Jesus as an adult, but there is a passage that pretty clearly shows, I think, that Mark does not understand that Jesus is born of a virgin. And it happens a couple chapters later when Jesus is doing his public ministry in chapter 3. He has these crowds around him, and his family, specifically his mother and his brothers, are upset. They think that he's gone out of his mind, is what the Greek literally says. And they come to take him out of the public view because they're afraid he's going to say or do something that's going to get him in trouble.
You stupid
Because they
fucking
think he's
bitch.
gone out of his mind. And so they try and get him out of that situation. So this is Mark chapter 3.
You're really starting to fucking
And
piss me off.
It's striking that it's his mother who doesn't understand that he's preaching the Word of God and that he's doing what God instructed him to do.
Fucking
So I think that's pretty clear indication. She didn't think that he was some kind of supernatural being who had been born of a virgin. She was his mother.
Jesus
And
fucking
so,
Christ.
and she's worried about it. So I don't think Mark did believe in a virgin birth.
Thank you very much. We'll be diving more into this in just a moment, but first
fucking
we have an
goddamn
announcement. We have a brand new semester-long course coming in January. It's called Ancient Christianities, the first 500 years, and it will be taught by Dr. Paula Fredrickson. This course takes you on a guided tour of how the early Jesus movement grew, splintered, debated, and eventually transformed the Roman world. If you've ever wondered how we got from Jesus to the church as we know it, then this is the perfect place to start. But I know you're excited about this. I'm excited about this. I had such a great time talking to Paula about her book. Why do you think people should take this course?
Goddamn.
Look, Paula, this for the paths and biblical studies. This is part of the online course thing. This is a real coup for us to get Paula Fredrickson to do this. Paula has been for the last 20, almost 30 years now. Paula has been like the international star of Christianity. One of them anyway. And she, many people have seen the PBS series From Jesus to Christ, and that's largely, it's largely based on her work in some ways. And so she's terrific. And she's just written a book called Ancient Christianity, which is this topic. And it is the first time you've had a kind of a broad sweep of what was really happening in early Christianity. We've had for decades, like a competent, really by a scholar book. And so I asked her, would you like to teach a course on this? And she said, yes. Oh, so this is going to be great. This is if you want information about early Christianity, this is the course to take. And she's an expert in everything, a serious expert on everything from Jesus to St. Augustine. She's got an incredible range. And this will be good.
And this is about as close as you can get to taking a course at a university without actually going to a university, right? There are quizzes and optional readings and...
No, this says reading. She taught at Boston University. She now teaches at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She has a wide-ranging teaching experience. And this is taking a university-level course with one of the world's experts on this course without paying university tuition fees. And this is definitely, and there'll be readings that people can do. And there'll be Q&A after each lecture. Each lecture will be 50 minutes with Q&A followed, live Q&A. And so it'll be set up like a university course. Just a tiny fraction of the cost.
and this is going to be a 20-lesson course that's starting on January 27th. We are offering optional early bird pricing. Who wants optional early bird pricing? We're offering early bird pricing through January 10th. So if you'd like to save on admission, you can visit bartehrman.com/500, that's 500, to sign up today. And as always, use the code MJPodcast at checkout for an additional discount. Okay, so back to virgin births and everything that may or may not entail. If the virgin birth of Jesus is not in our earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, then what is the earliest reference we have to it? Is it just Matthew?
It's just Matthew. Matthew, most people think Matthew was written after Mark and before Luke. And Matthew's the first hint we have of it in any of our writings. As I said, Paul was writing before any of the Gospels, and he doesn't say a word about it. Paul says only one thing about Jesus' birth. It's in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. And what Paul says is that Christ was born of a woman.
Solid information.
And I think he's right about that. I'm not quite sure it is beta like why you want to point that one out. But it is interesting that he does not say anything about her being a virgin, which would have suited his purposes very well had he ever heard of that. And I assume it would have suited Mark's purposes very well also if he had ever heard of it. And so this suggests that the idea of Jesus being born of a virgin is not one of the early views of Christianity, and it's first tested in Matthew, which is probably written sometime in the mid-80s, so over 8 decades after the event itself.
So we have virgin birth in the Gospel of Luke as well. Do scholars think that it was included for the same reasons as Matthew included it, or is Luke doing something different with it?
No, it looks like Luke's doing something different. So Luke has also heard of the story about being born of a virgin. It's not clear whether Matthew invented it, or if it was starting to float around, they both had heard accounts of it. That's my guess. They both heard accounts because what they say about it is very different. Not necessarily contradictory, but really different. In Matthew's account, the reason Jesus is born of a virgin is to fulfill Scripture. This is what the Scripture said. Jesus did it. It shows he's the Messiah. And so that's fairly straightforward. Luke has a different presentation. He doesn't say that it was to fulfill Isaiah 7:14. Luke seems to be more influenced by these stories of demigods that we were talking about, where a divine being gets a mortal pregnant. And because I think that's pretty clear from the Annunciation scene that's in Luke and only in Luke. In Luke chapter 1, we have the account of Mary being a young woman, a young girl, really, probably we're to assume in both these accounts that she's like a teenager, a young teenager. The angel Gabriel appears to her out of the blue, literally, and tells her that she's going to conceive and bear a son. And she says, well, this is only Luke. How's that going to happen? I've never known a man. I've never had sex with a man. And then the angel Gabriel replies that the Holy Spirit shall come upon you, the power of the Most High will overshadow you, so that the one born of you shall be called holy, the Son of God. In this case, the reason she gets pregnant by the Spirit is because this literally makes Jesus the Son of God. God's the one who gets her pregnant. And so in that case, it's trying to explain how he is, in that sense, a divine being. So it's not about fulfilling Scripture. It's about him being born in a unique way. And so I think it's probably dependent on these stories about other people being born of a union of God and mortal, but it is taking it a step further. Now it's a virgin. So it's like it's kind of one-upping these stories.
Stupid!
So this story was maybe not invented by Matthew, but seems to have been introduced around that time. Why do you think the virgin birth became so important to Christian theology?
Well, it does become very important to the extent, as I've indicated, that throughout a long chunk of history, people have said if you don't believe that this actually happened, then you can't be a Christian. That's always struck me as kind of an odd thing, because Paul doesn't seem to have believed in it. I assume he was a Christian. But so that's the claim. But I think it's because without this kind of miraculous birth, in the opinion of theologians, that Jesus is just a human like everyone else. And that if he actually was the result of a sexual act between Joseph and Mary, that he's just like us. And in one sense, theologians wanted to say that Jesus is just like us, because if he's not fully human, he can't really die for the sins of humans. He can't be a substitute for humans who sin. So he's got to be human. But at the same time, they've got to claim that he's also divine. Because if he's not divine, then he's just like one of us, and I can't die for anyone else in the same way that he did. And so he's got to be divine. And this is their way of explaining his divinity. Without the virgin birth, he can't be divine. And so it became very
dumbass.
Okay, so we don't have a virgin birth at all in Mark, and possibly a suggestion that he was unfamiliar with this idea to begin with. We have a virgin birth in Matthew to fulfill prophecy from the Hebrew Bible. We have a virgin birth in Luke to make him fully the Son of God. What happens in the Gospel of John?
John is very interesting because it's written after Matthew and Luke. There are debates about whether John knew Matthew and Luke. I think the answer is no. But some of my colleagues disagree, as happens. Whether he knew Matthew and Luke or not, he does not have a virgin birth. John has Jesus being the incarnation of God on earth. And so the famous prologue of John begins by saying, "In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And all things came into being through him. Nothing came into being that did not come into being through him." It emphasizes that Christ was the beginning with God, a divine being with God who wasn't identical with God, but he was also God, and he's the one through whom God created the universe. And then at the end of this section of John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, in verse 14, the author says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory as of the only unique Son of the Father."
Dumbass.
And so it goes on to identify him as Jesus Christ. And so in John's Gospel, there's no virgin birth, there's an incarnation, where a divine being becomes a human being. We're not told how John imagines that happening. But he says nothing about Mary being a virgin. And in fact, there are some suggestions that he didn't think so. The one suggestion, I think we mentioned in an earlier podcast, is in chapter 8 of John, where the author has Jesus talking to his opponents, called the Jews in John, and they're having a dispute about various theological things, and especially about who Jesus really is. And Jesus claims to have superior authority to the Jewish opponents. And they point out at one point that he cannot be really closely aligned with God. And they say to him, "Look, we were not born out of wedlock." And it sounds like they're taking a jab at Jesus for being known to have been born, that Mary wasn't married when he was born. But John himself never kind of corrects that by saying, "Yeah, well, okay, I was born of a virgin, so it's okay." And so it doesn't look like John knows about it.
So how does John's understanding of Jesus' incarnation relate to...
Not born out of closely aligned with God. And they say to him, "Look, we were not born out of wedlock." And it sounds like they're taking a jab at Jesus for being known to have been born, that Mary wasn't married when he was born. But John himself never kind of corrects that by saying, "Yeah, well, okay, I was born of a virgin, so it's okay." And so it doesn't look like John knows about it.
So how does John's understanding of Jesus' incarnation relate to Matthew and Luke's understanding of the virgin birth?
I think if you look at them closely, they're at odds with each other. And this is not noticed by people, and it's not noticed, and theologians have set it up so it doesn't sound that way, and because of what's in the creed. In the Christian creed that people have said for centuries, you have this line that Christ became incarnate through the Virgin Mary. So that's that familiar statement from the Creed. He became incarnate through the Virgin Mary. That is taking both what John says and what Matthew and Luke says and puts them together. So there is an incarnation. He's a pre-existent divine being who became a human being, and it happened through the Virgin Mary. But the accounts of the incarnation say nothing about Mary being a virgin, and the accounts of her being a virgin say nothing about the incarnation. They're different conceptualizations. Just to take Luke and John, Luke understands that Jesus is the Son of God literally because God gets Mary pregnant. John understands that Jesus is the Son of God because he was a pre-existent being who came into the world. What happens then, you combine the two so that he's incarnate through the Virgin Mary, which is what neither one of them says. And so you're kind of mixing up two theological categories and coming up with your own view, which is found in none of the Gospels. And so, people typically do that, but I'm not sure it's the best way to read any of these Gospels because you're misunderstanding them. If you're imposing another Gospel's view on this Gospel, which doesn't have that view, you end up misunderstanding both of them, I think.
In the same way that people who try and reconcile the differences in Matthew and Luke's Christmas narrative are missing the point of both.
They're missing the point because all they can think about is coming up with the kind of an amalgamation that makes sense of it all, which is fine. You want to do that, that's okay, you can do that. But if you really take these authors seriously as authors and think they really have something to say to you, you don't want to pretend that they're saying the same thing some other author is saying. If I got a student writes a term paper and I evaluate it based on what some other student said in his term paper, the student wouldn't like that. And I agree with that each author has a message. And when your concern is just to amalgamate them all, to make them all consistent with each other, you're missing each person's message.
Well, that is all for today's interview, Bart. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to this week's bonus segment, which is Misquoting Bart. Today we are breaking the cardinal rule of YouTube, which is never read the comments, and we're going to be having Bart respond to a comment by Dr. James White, which was recently posted on YouTube on the Apologia YouTube channel. I expected Ehrman to have a very nuanced, thought-through position, and this is almost childish. He literally believes that if the Bible was inspired, God would have prohibited any scribe from ever making a mistake in the transmission of the text. And so, since scribes make errors, then the Bible can't be inspired. Exactly how does that work? Was God just supposed to make the scribes spontaneously combust? What's he going to do? Bart, what are your thoughts?
Wow. He thinks my thinking is nuanced, and that's his view? Okay. So, look, I think he's referring to something I said in my book, Misquoting Jesus, and he's completely misunderstanding it. So you're right, misquoting Bart. In my book, Misquoting Jesus, I explain how I got very interested